postal worker is shot dead on a highway.
There was multiple gunshots to the front of Tony Mosby's postal truck.
Oh, man.
We had nothing, no suspect information, anything.
And no indication that that victim was doing anything but his job when someone fired shots into his vehicle.
Detectives zero in on potential suspects.
I need you to be honest with me. I know that she's leaving a lot out. This is your life on the line.
A mother's tough love breaks down a barrier.
I didn't raise you to be no liar. Tell them the truth.
I'm sorry, Mama.
Are you a covert killer?
No, I'm not a killer.
Investigators searching for answers in the interrogation room.
I'm so sorry.
Dallas 911, this is Liz. What's the location?
Yes, I need paramedics and police. I'm at 30 eastbound. I need somebody here real quick.
What's going on there?
Someone has shot a driver. This is the postal service. There's a postal vehicle here. I don't know if he's still breathing, but there's a gunshot through the front windshield. Oh, man.
The driver of a USPS box truck crashed into the guardrail. When officers arrived, they say that driver was already dead.
We learned that one of our motor vehicle service drivers was shot and killed while he was in the course of his duties on I-30. We were able to identify the victim as Mr. Tony Mosby. He had been with the post office about 14 years, 58 years of age at the time.
There was multiple gunshots to the front of Tony Mosby's postal truck. One of the rounds had gone through the windshield and struck him in the face. And that was the round that took his life. When a postal employee is murdered, we, as a federal agency, have federal jurisdiction. We take that very seriously and we pull out all the stops.
Uncle Tony was just a very hard worker. He was the glue, the backbone of the Mosby side of the family.
He was a big teddy bear, a hardworking, very caring and lovable person. He was always working. That's one thing he loved doing, was working.
I definitely looked up to, his work ethic, his drive, and, that ambition. He was really a great man.
What the police was able to tell us was that, Uncle Tony was just shot and killed, and that they don't know who did it. I was just in shock.
I was definitely thinking about who could have done this to Tony, because he never really bothered anybody.
Right now, police have no witnesses, no surveillance video, no suspect in the death of this USPS truck driver, and no indication that that victim was doing anything but his job when someone fired shots into his vehicle.
When I arrived at the scene, we had nothing, no suspect information, anything.
One of the things that's very important is to establish a timeline, and we got to start putting the puzzle together to help lead us to the person that's responsible for this.
We started canvassing the area and doing everything that we possibly could to try to find out if there were any surveillance video, anything around that could help us capture this incident on camera.
There was a gas station that actually had video showing Mr. Mosby's vehicle, the truck that he was driving, right before it entered the interstate. That gave us a good idea of when he was getting on the interstate. Another critical piece was there was neighborhoods adjoining the interstate that had electric doorbell that with video and audio, what appeared to be 4 shots.
but we still didn't know who committed this horrible crime. It was a lot of pressure.
The United States Postal Service is now offering $50,000 as a reward for any information about a shooting that killed one of its employees.
When $50,000 was placed forward, it made the world of difference in this case.
Her relative worked for the Postal Service, and I think once they had learned Mr. Mosby had died, it was weighing on her.
Today's date is February 21st, 2018. Time is 11:48. Jessica, my name is Derek Cheney. I'm with the Dallas Police Department.
And I'm Paul Ecker with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service.
If interviewing and interrogating anyone, you have to make them comfortable. She was very nervous, very scared, because she knew this murder's been on the news. She know information about it.
We really appreciate you stepping up and doing the right thing and being here, okay?
Okay.
You're not under custody.
Right.
You're not in custody, and you're free to leave at any point. So all this is voluntary information that you're providing. Yes. No one's threatening you or anything to that effect. Okay.
We had dinner there. After we were done, his cousin, Donnie, actually called us to see if we wanted to go bowling or anything. We had them meet us outside the restaurant.
Okay, and you said they. Who was all?
Donnie is his cousin, and Chanel is the girlfriend.
Do you know him by Donnie? Do you know by his last name?
It's Farrell.
Donnie Farrell.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Tell me what happened.
We decided that we were going to go to a bar and shoot some pool.
A lot of times people, they're a little bit hesitant to come forward when it comes down to these investigations. They always have a saying, snitches get stitches. So we want to make sure that they can talk to us and come forward about everything.
What happened?
We then left and went to CJ's Billiards. We were there roughly until about 1:30. After that, we tried to go back to the hotel. Chanel was driving.
Okay.
Donnie was in the passenger seat.
Okay.
There was a U.S. postal truck in front of us. She was driving very close to this truck. She then swerved over to go around him. We passed up this U.S. postal truck. According to Donnie, the driver of that truck flipped us off. And I looked to the right, and the gun that Donnie had was sticking out to my side of the window.
Okay. How did he position his body?
He kind of leaned out a little bit to where his head and his right arm was sticking out of the window. I had heard it go off.
How many shots did you hear?
Roughly about 3.
And all 3 shots came from the gun that you saw Donnie's hold?
Correct.
Do you have your phone now?
Yes,
Could you show me a picture of him?
I sure can.
At that point, we have now identified the shooter, Don Farrell.
Okay, describe the gun for me.
Looked like a revolver, but kind of like a newer revolver, not one of those.
You know what color?
Silver.
And she said that gun was a revolver. And so now we have an idea if this projectile comes back to a gun that is a revolver. Now we could say that this is a possible bullet from the gun that was used to kill the victim.
Putting all that together, we had enough to get a warrant.
Wednesday evening, we had postal inspectors at the residence of Miss Walker. And as they were out on surveillance, they saw Mr. Farrell exit the residence with a weapon in his hand. Mr. Farrell saw the agents and ran back in the house, and we then had a barricade situation. Dallas County Sheriff's Office sent their tactical team out to this residence in Hutchins, Texas, and began to establish lines of communication. Miss Walker and the rest of the family members were able to exit the residence. Mr. Farrell stayed behind.
When I went up into the interview room with her, my main objective was to build a rapport with her.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. You, gonna be alone.
Well, I hope so.
Her boyfriend was now barricaded inside that residence. I know there was some worry for her, but we want to make sure that she understands when you're not truthful, it can draw some questions about your involvement as well. Just be straightforward with me, okay?
The victim, Tony Mosby, was a U.S. postal worker, and as such, she was a federal employee. That means if law enforcement can catch his killer, that person will likely face a murder charge in federal court.
So, Chanel, I'm working this case, and your name came up in my investigation. My initial approach to her was to let her know that I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm gonna tell you the truth, but now I need you to also be honest with me and tell me what happened. Like I told you before, when I told you out there, I'm looking at you as a witness, okay? But at the same time, I need you to be perfectly honest with me about everything. I'm talking about start to finish. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm not gonna feed you no fried ice cream. I'm gonna be 100% with you, okay? So, will you be honest with me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's go back a few days, okay? So, what happened on the 18th?
Which is Sunday, right?
Right.
Sunday. Me and Donnie, we was at home.
Now, what is Donnie's name?
Donnie Farrell Jr.
Okay. And who is he to you?
My fiance. He had texted his cousin and asked what they were doing. They said they probably want to go shoot pool or whatever. So we found a pool hall that closed like at 2, and we was like, okay, we're just gonna go there and shoot pool.
What time y'all leave the pool hall?
I think it was about close to 2 or at 2. At this point, he's driving because I was too intoxicated to drive, and I didn't want to wreck or do nothing. So I think we went home.
Okay. And that was it. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing the information that I have, that I learned up until this point, I know that she's leaving a lot out. I'm talking to you as a witness, all right?
Yes, sir.
But at the same time, you can. I know that you drove the whole night, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I know that, okay?
Yes, sir.
I know that there's more to that highway incident, and I know you love your fiance, okay? But I need you to be honest with me, okay?
Yes, sir. When we left the pool hall, we was on the freeway. And I was drunk and I was driving. And he was on the passenger side, and he was like, babe, can I let off? And I was like, no. What? I was like, no, Donnie, what the did I tell you about doing stupid stuff like that? But he did it anyway.
When you said let it off, what did he shoot his gun or what?
Yeah, he shot his gun.
And what did he do? Show me what he did. Where is he sitting at?
He's sitting in the passenger side.
Right, I'm him. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm him. Okay. So he's right here. So when I have her to go through the details, I just wanted her to actually give me that visual. You know, I'm talking to her, thinking back to that morning when I was out there on that scene, so that way I'll know how the shooting actually took place. Well, you go ahead and be right here, and I'm gonna sit right here. Okay. So you driving? You on the highway? Yeah. Okay. Who's on the highway with you guys? What's in front of you? What's around you?
I don't know what.
Any other vehicles on the road with you?
No, I really didn't see any. I don't really know if it was any cars on the freeway when we was on the freeway.
Chanel.
I really wasn't paying attention.
Okay, let's remember. Let's be honest with each other. Okay.
I am.
You driving. I'm you. I'm driving. Okay, and you're him. How did he do it?
I guess he just put it out the window.
He did. He used his right hand. And he just.
And I guess he just like shot it off.
All right. Was there anybody around?
I don't.
And Chanel? I know that she knows more. I'm still trying to get her to come forth with more information, more details, so that way I could match what I have at the scene.
I really was intoxicated. I really don't know what all was said and how it was said. I can only tell you what I remember from that night and Saturday. My mom had asked me what happened.
When did she ask you what happened?
When we were outside. And we were waiting, and we've been trying to call him to get him to come outside.
All right, so that's when your mom's asking you to what happened, stuff like that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Give me 1 second, okay?
Yes, sir.
And I explained it to her mother how serious this was. So I allowed her mother to go into the interview room. It was a risky move. I didn't want her to shut down on me.
I'm gonna tell you like this. I know you love this dude. This man that lost his life. Listen to me. Tell them the truth. It's nothing you can do now. Donnie did what he did. That was messed up. You gotta look at that family. If that was your story, you would want somebody to tell you. Did you hear what I'm saying?
Yes, Mom.
I didn't raise you to be no liar for nobody, for no and for no female. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yes, Mom.
You tell these officers everything. You have a freaking son you gotta think about. Do you hear what I'm saying? You tell him every single thing, Beijing. Don't you hide nothing back. Because that man got kids and he can't see his kids no more. If that was you or your daddy or your brothers or something, you would want somebody to tell the truth. His family need closure. Do you hear what I'm saying? Tell them the truth.
I'm sorry, Mom.
I'm good.
I'm sorry.
I'm Beijing. I'm good.
I'm sorry.
You tell them what happened.
Sorry, Mom.
One thing, I commend this mother here, even though she know how bad it is. She reminds me of the parenting that I grew up on, that old school parenting where, hey, no matter how bad it seems, always tell the truth.
Tell them the truth. And you tell them everything, word for word, what happened, how it was set up, what was done. Tell them the truth, Beijing. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Don't lie. Do you hear me?
Yes, Mom.
Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Once the mother came out, I just felt good that it was time to go back in there. Let's talk, okay? All right. I need to know, Chanel. Okay. What happened?
Okay. I was driving, and I think the only truck or the only vehicle I seen on the highway was the mail truck, and I wasn't paying attention to if he was cutting me off or not, or kept jumping in front of me. So Donnie was like, he keep cutting us off or whatever, and he said that he gave us the finger, but I didn't know, I didn't see it. And like I said, I didn't see him with the gun in his hand, but I heard it go off. And that's when I guess the truck had swerved over and hit the rail or something like that.
Okay.
And that's what, that's what I seen or I experienced.
The main reason why he wanted to fire off because...
Maybe because the guy caught up in front of us, but I don't know, because he was like, babe, can I let off one time? And, that's when I had seen the truck swerve over and was behind me, and I guess it had hit the wall or something like that. And I'm not gonna lie to you, like, I wasn't even in that state of mind of, thinking that he would do something like that.
Okay.
I didn't know, because like I said, I think I had more drinks than him, and I'm so sorry. Like, this is not him. This is not him. I never would have imagined him doing anything like that, because that's not the type of person he is.
Became very emotional. I mean, this is his girlfriend. They're expecting a child together. It must have been hard to give up this information. How long y'all been together?
We've been together since November. He proposed to me on Christmas Eve.
He know about the possible baby on the way?
Yes.
I feel that Mom's conversation with her really helped her understand the seriousness of this investigation. So that's why she gave me the information she's given me and pretty much corroborated with everything that I already had received.
But I feel sorry for what happened to this man, because I wouldn't want nothing to happen like this to my son. And I'm trying to do right and let you guys know.
But you had no idea?
No, sir, I didn't. Because when he asked me, can he fire off, it just asked me, to me, that was asking me, can he just shoot his gun off, like to try to show, I guess, because his cousin and the cousin girlfriend was in a car with us. So that's how I took it as. But I still told him no, because I don't like him doing that. And now this happened.
Okay. All right. Give me 1 second, okay?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Do I believe she left out some important details? Yes, because she did not want to put her boyfriend in jail. But he knew where to push her to make her tell the truth.
Investigators made an arrest last night. Donnie Farrell, the 25-year-old, was reportedly the passenger in a car that was driving erratically on I-30 near downtown Dallas early Monday morning.
We already had an idea of what our challenges was. We know that he will deny he had any involvement, but also he didn't know what we knew already.
It's all about that approach, so that way they'll know me, not just a guy with a gun and badge. Walking into that room knowing that everything is at stake, it's game time.
Law enforcement was able to track down the suspect.
In the murder of Tony Mosby.
Police arrested 25-year-old Donnie Farrell after a lengthy standoff.
I was just so relieved, you know, he was finally off the street, and then it was just so angry. He didn't hurt your family. He wasn't, you know, breaking into your home. Why would you need to do something like this?
Thanks, so man. I need to talk to you, okay? All right. You all right with that? So, what's your name, man?
Donnie Farrell.
Donnie, okay. Where you from?
Where I'm from?
Yeah.
Where I was born?
Yeah.
Los Angeles, California. I was born in West Covina, California.
You from LA?
Yeah, I grew up in LA.
Okay, cool. So the biggest thing when I walked into that room, I wanted to make him feel comfortable. So my goal was to build a relationship with him, build a rapport with him. You know, what do you call it? You call it Chanel?
Chanel.
Okay, hell yeah. So you love him?
I love her to death.
That's what I'm talking about. Love her to death. All right. How long did it take y'all to be boyfriend and girlfriend?
I'm gonna say about a week and a half. It was kind of like love at first sight, you know.
Oh, so you when you saw her, you said, I ain't down.
I just knew the presence was strong. I felt it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, you see yourself building a lot with her, right? Right. To my understanding too, it's a possibility that you guys may be expecting her, right? You got a baby on the way, possibility, right?
Mm-hmm. And I got a 4-year-old stepson.
You got a 4-year-old stepson. I felt like he was reserved, that I wanted to get across to him to let him know, even though you're arrested right now, I'm human. Let's talk and we'll move forward. In this case, I know you were there, okay? I know you were there, and I know really what happened, but I want to help me understand, okay, what happened, Mark. Yeah, like I told you before, everybody make mistakes. No, you made plenty of mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes, all right? But at the end of the day, as men, okay, we own up to what we've done, right? And we move on, all right? All right, so on the way from the pool hall, where did y'all go?
It's foggy. I don't remember stopping nowhere. After we left the bar, I don't remember stopping nowhere.
Okay. Huh?
I can't remember stopping nowhere else.
Okay, so
I'm like really half asleep, you know. I'm like so faded.
He kept using the term he was faded, meaning that he was under the influence. He was trying to make me believe that he was so drunk where he just don't remember anything. I knew that wasn't truthful. So when y'all on the highway, y'all headed back to the hotel. All right. What happened?
When we heading back to the hotel?
Mm-hmm. Did you get into it with anybody? You didn't. Okay. I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna be straightforward with you, man. And like I have been the whole time. I know there was more to this case. I ain't lied to you from the day one. When I came in, I hadn't been mean to you. Anytime I've been straight, respectful to you, right?
And you seem like a straightforward
yeah.
man.
I wanted him to continue to talk to me, so I wanted to continue to drill those things into him. Hey, don't lie to me. Tell me the truth. This is your life on the line. I've been working this case and got a lot of information. You see what I'm saying? And that's why I need you to be real honest with me, because I'd rather for me to your own story than me to have to tell your story. I know you're not a cold-blooded killer. All right? I know you're not. I know you're not a cold-blooded killer. Are you a cold-blooded killer?
No, I'm not a killer.
I know that there was an incident where an individual may have been cutting you guys off. And I don't know if he made a gesture towards you, flipped you off or whatever, but at that point in time, you had a gun on you. Did you mean to kill him?
Who said I killed him?
So at this point, I believe that he wasn't taking me serious where I kept saying, I know, but he was at a point in time, okay, if you know, prove it. Did you mean to shoot at him?
Who said I shot at him?
I'm not gonna play no games with you, you know what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying. I know you know. I do. Had his arms folded, had a frown on his face. He's sizing me up, I'm sizing him up. I didn't think that he believed that, because I kept telling him, I know that you shot. So I started digging a little deeper to give him some more information, to let him know I know what happened. I've spoken with Chanel, right? I've spoken with Jessica. I've spoken with these folks. You see what I'm saying? And you the last one left. I know you fired at the guy. I know you fired at the vehicle that he was in, all right? You think we just showed up at your house and picked you out of all these millions of folk? You think we did that? Just out of random, we say, hey, we're gonna mess with old Donnie Jr. today. You think we did that? No, Doc. That ain't the way it works. You see what I'm saying? You're a young man. You got your whole life ahead of you, all right? But I need to know what happened. Did he make you that angry? Or was it just an accident?
I was faded.
You was faded.
I was real like out of
it. The gun. How long you owned the gun?
I ain't owned it that long. It was not even mine. It was given to me.
It was given to you? Who gave it to you?
Some guy.
Really? How? What kind of gun is it?
38.
At any moment, he could ask for his attorney. So I wanted to make sure to keep him talking to me.
The only reason I had it, to be honest with you, being honest, is I was working at 7-Eleven. That's why it was given to me.
Okay.
Because I was working up there.
And for the past robbery, I mean, that's understandable. I mean, you got to protect yourself all the time. But we talking about this guy here. This man didn't deserve to die. You know what I mean? This man that you shot and killed. This man was at work. You hear me? Did you mean to do it?
No, I didn't.
Were you just trying to scare him, or what was it?
That was like my main intention.
Was it just because you thought he was trying to cut you off, or what was it?
No, I mean, at the same time, look, I ain't trying to make no excuses. You know, I did what I did.
Yeah.
Gotta face the consequences. But I was intoxicated. Like I said, I was so faded, man. Like my eyes were barely open.
Okay. All right, give me 1 second.
There were times that Detective Walton would exit, come out to us, and we would just discuss things on the checklist, things that we wanted to make sure were answered. What we wanted to do was to get Mr. Farrell to the point of fully describing how he shot at Mr. Mosby.
When you shot at him, did he see you? Because I know y'all were close. I mean, y'all had to be close to him. Y'all were close.
He wasn't that close. He was behind us.
Okay, so
I know that.
So okay. So Chanel driving. You said put your chair up so I'm just trying to get a visual.
Like you know my fiance.
Yeah. Okay. So we drive. Put your chair up some more. Put your chair up some more. So okay, Kurt, we right here. All right. So Chanel driving. All right. So what was that? What we're asking? When y'all getting on the ramp, what happened?
I don't know. I was faded.
Okay.
I don't know nothing about how we got on.
Okay, but you know how you shot. How did you shot? Which hand did you use to shoot?
My right.
So how did you?
Like that.
Huh?
Like this.
You did just like this, and you pulled the trigger, and you say you emptied it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
When Detective Walton had him demonstrate how he shot, that can show his intent because you have to aim exactly in the direction of that truck to hit that driver.
I know you had to look back. I did not. I was so faded. I just. It couldn't have been a way. Now that I'm thinking about it. The truth, I just want like that. Because when the information I got, you saw what you were doing. You shooting like this. Be straightforward. I'm being straightforward. I'm like that. To shoot like this, all right, and to be that accurate. Done. I'm telling you the truth.
I started telling him it's not believable. And it was a risky move because at any moment he could ask for his attorney.
Just saying, I'm asking these things for a reason. You know, if you try to protect your girl, just say it. Just be straightforward and tell me. You know what I'm saying? If you feel like he disrespected your girl, I mean, you already told me you love that girl.
Based on his demeanor and based on the way he was acting inside the room, I knew that he was getting ready to be honest. You come this far, don't hold back now.
You did just like this. Just like this. Just like this. And this man made you mad by the way he was driving. You know what I'm saying? This man made you mad by the way he was driving. You have to look like this. No, like this. If I looked, I was looking in the rearview mirror because he was behind us. I was looking to the side. So you didn't turn your head just like this. Be straightforward with that. Straight.
I want to get a true and complete understanding, knowing that I have witnesses saying this, I have evidence that's saying this, but you're saying something else. That's a problem.
I'm asking these things for a reason because, like I say, I've talked to a lot of people. All right, the way you said that you did this, all right, that's not going to be believable. You know these rooms are recorded. You know what I mean? You got people that's watching this video. I did like this. Did like this. You did what? Like what? I did like that. You looked and you saw it. You saw which way you were shooting. Yeah, I did. You did. Yeah. You weren't looking straight. No, I did like this. You did like that.
Now we're at the point where I felt like he's giving me everything.
And the main reason why you shot the gun and you look back like that is because of why? I was intoxicated and he tried to cut us off. Well, he did cut us off. So you pissed off about that? Yeah, he flipped us off. And he gave you the finger, and that pissed you off, and that's why you shot. So like, where is this tape gonna be showed at court? No, it's about I mean, this is all a part of the investigation. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, well, yeah, I did like that. What? I'm gonna be honest with you, boss. Had it been somebody else, I wouldn't even have told him.
We set the foundation where he could talk and made him comfortable, and that way he felt as if he could talk to me.
I'm gonna be honest with you, you're gonna be charged with murder tonight, okay? Well, let me ask you this straight up, man. Like, you tell me I'm young, I got my whole life ahead of me. I made this mistake. How long you think they're gonna get me? You know, I don't know. I don't make those decisions. I'm not gonna lie to you. What kind of murder is it? It's murder. It's murder? Yeah.
He finally sank over in his chair, and you saw his shoulders drop and his head drop, and it seemed like the full acceptance was finally there. He realized this show was over. There wasn't any more denial. There wasn't any more covering it up.
honestly think that his ego got the best of him that night that led up to the victim's death. Once you pull that trigger, you have to take ownership, knowing that that bullet can come out that gun, and if it hits someone, it can kill somebody.
Miss Walker, for her involvement in this, she was charged with a single count of accessory after the fact and received 4 years of federal probation. This type of crime is a perfect example of what a senseless murder would be defined as. Even if there was a traffic altercation in some way, no one deserves to be shot at. It seemed like this was a situation, just the wrong place and the wrong time, and that's what's so unfortunate in this case.
When it comes down to homicide, it takes a special person mentally to do this job. You think about bringing some kind of closure to the family, but not saying they're going to get closure. Because you're talking about you taking a piece of their heart away when their loved one had passed away.
Do I feel as if justice was served? I don't. He only got 30 years in prison. He'll still get to walk free on this earth when my uncle couldn't anymore because he took his life away.
I was very appreciative of the officers and the detective of all the hard work and the jobs that they did. I was happy that person was finally off of the street. I miss Tony very much. There's really never not a time I'm not thinking about him because he was really a great man and is very well missed. It just hurts, man.
The morning of January 30th, 1976, began like any other winter morning in Hermosa Beach, California. The ocean was close. The streets were quiet. Families were beginning another ordinary day. And somewhere inside that ordinary morning, a 32-year-old mother named Karen Kloss was about to disappear into one of the most haunting murder investigations in Southern California history. Karen had just dropped off her 4-year-old son at school. She returned to her home. She was expected to meet friends later that morning. Nothing about her routine suggested danger. There was no warning, no desperate phone call, no neighbor reporting an argument. No one knew that Karen had walked into a nightmare from which she would never wake. By the time people realized something was wrong, the silence inside her home had become terrifying. Karen was found unconscious. She had been brutally assaulted, beaten and strangled with her own pantyhose. She was taken to a hospital, but she never regained consciousness. 5 days later, on February 4, 1976, Karen Kloss died from the injuries inflicted upon her. The crime shocked Hermosa Beach. This was a small coastal community. Murders were rare. The violence seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the quiet neighborhood surrounding Karen's home. But there was something else that made the case explode into the public consciousness. Karen had once been married to Bill Medley, the singer who would become famous as half of the Righteous Brothers. Their marriage had ended years earlier, but Medley remained close to Karen. She was not simply an ex-wife. She remained, by his own later description, one of his best friends. And now she was dead. Her 2 young sons were left without their mother. Investigators entered a crime scene filled with questions and almost no answers. Someone had been inside Karen's home. Someone had attacked her. Someone had walked away. And that person seemed to vanish into the California landscape. 2 witnesses reported seeing a man leaving the area around the time of the attack. Years later, investigators described him as a shaggy-haired, bearded man wearing a trench coat and blue jeans. It was a description that sounded specific enough to inspire hope, yet vague enough to produce nothing. Who was he? Had he been watching Karen? Did he know her? Had he entered the home deliberately? Or had Karen encountered a complete stranger who happened to cross her path at exactly the wrong moment? The first investigators had to work without the forensic technology that would later transform the case. There were no modern DNA databases capable of instantly comparing biological evidence against millions of profiles. There was no genetic genealogy. There was no sophisticated familial searching. There was only the evidence investigators could collect, preserve, and interpret with the tools available in 1976. And among that evidence was something that would survive long after the detectives, witnesses, and suspects were gone. Biological evidence. Investigators preserved material from the crime scene, including a towel found near Karen's body. Decades later, that evidence would become one of the keys to identifying the person responsible. But in 1976, the evidence could not tell investigators the name they desperately needed. The investigation widened. People were questioned. Suspects were examined. Karen's husband was considered and ultimately ruled out. The case remained open. Then time began doing what time always does to a murder investigation. It erased memories. It scattered witnesses. It changed neighborhoods. Changed technology. It changed the people who were searching. And Karen's children grew older without their mother. The case did not disappear. It simply became colder. Years passed. 10 years. 20. Then 30. The world around the case changed almost beyond recognition. The technology that once seemed like science fiction became reality. DNA testing emerged as a powerful weapon against unidentified killers. And eventually, investigators were able to develop a DNA profile from evidence connected to Karen's attacker. But the profile produced a cruel kind of answer. It belonged to someone. Yet investigators could not determine who. The killer was still invisible. In 1999, authorities released additional information to the public, hoping someone might recognize the man described by witnesses. The image of the shaggy-haired, bearded stranger in a trench coat and blue jeans resurfaced. But no breakthrough came. Investigators also used DNA testing to eliminate several original suspects. Again, the science was telling them what the killer was not. But not who he was. The distinction mattered. Because a cold case can survive for decades when the evidence is strong enough to prove a crime, but not strong enough to identify the person responsible. Karen's murder became exactly that kind of case. A mystery preserved in evidence boxes. A name missing from a file. A family waiting for an answer. And a killer who was already beyond the reach of ordinary investigation. Then came another strange twist. The man eventually identified as Karen's killer was not hiding in another country. He was not living under a new identity. He was not waiting to be discovered decades later. He was already dead. His name was Kenneth Eugene Troyer. He had been 29 years old when Karen was killed. Years after the murder, Troyer became involved in other crimes and was eventually imprisoned. In 1982, he escaped from a California prison. During the period surrounding his escape, authorities connected him to other sexual assaults and robberies. Later that year, he was shot and killed by police in Orange County. The man who had haunted investigators for 4 decades was already gone. But nobody knew it. Not Karen's family. Not the public. Not the detectives who continued to examine the case. And not Bill Medley, who had spent years wondering whether the killer was still alive. There was another problem. When Troyer died in 1982, California did not yet require the kind of DNA collection that would later place convicted offenders into criminal databases. So even though investigators eventually had the DNA profile of Karen's attacker, the obvious database comparison produced nothing. The killer's genetic signature existed. His identity did not. It was as if investigators had found the killer's fingerprint in a locked room, but had no name to attach to it. Then, decades later, A completely different person's crime would change everything. A relative of Troyer committed a qualifying offense. That relative's DNA entered a state database. And suddenly, investigators had something they had never possessed before. Not a direct match. A family connection. A genetic breadcrumb leading backward through a family tree. Investigators conducted a familial DNA search, looking for a close relative whose genetic profile could point toward the unidentified offender. The search eventually directed them toward Kenneth Eugene Troyer. Investigators then obtained a DNA sample associated with Troyer from the Orange County Coroner's Office. The comparison was decisive. The biological evidence from the Karen Kloss crime scene was linked to Troyer. After more than 4 decades, investigators finally had a name. And suddenly, the old description of the stranger leaving Karen's home was no longer just a description. It had a name behind it. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. A man who could never be arrested. A man who could never stand trial. A man who could never look into Karen's family's eyes and answer the question they had carried for 41 years. Why her? Why that morning? Why did he enter her home? And how many other crimes had he committed before his own violent death? The case that had begun in 1976 was finally solved in January 2017. Not because a witness suddenly remembered something. Not because a confession appeared. Not because a suspect walked into a police station. It was solved because science had finally caught up with evidence that had been waiting patiently for 40 years. The story of Karen Kloss is often described as a mystery broken by DNA. But the deeper story is more unsettling. The answer had been sitting inside the evidence all along. The crime scene had preserved a biological trace. Investigators had preserved that evidence. Technology eventually extracted its meaning. And time had not destroyed the final clue. It had only delayed the moment when someone would understand it. For Karen's family, however, solving the case could never restore what had been taken. Karen was still gone. Her children had still grown up without their mother. There would be no childhood mornings recovered. No birthdays repeated. No family photograph from a future that never happened. No opportunity for Karen to watch her sons become adults. No chance for her to become the grandmother Bill Medley later imagined she would have been. The police could name the killer. They could explain how the case was solved. They could close the file. But they could not reverse February 4, 1976. That date remained permanent. Karen's life had been divided into before and after. Before the attack, she was a mother, a friend, a former wife, a woman living an ordinary life near the California coast. After the attack, she became a name in a cold case file. A photograph. A missing future. A question. And for decades that question had no answer. The passage of time created another cruel illusion. As the years accumulated, it became easier to believe the truth would never be known. People who had witnessed the aftermath aged. Detectives retired. Evidence remained locked away. The neighborhood changed. The children grew up. The killer died. But the case stayed alive. And eventually, the smallest invisible fragments of the past became more powerful than the living witnesses. DNA does not forget. It does not become uncertain because 40 years have passed. It does not lose the biological signature of a person simply because that person is dead. That is why the eventual breakthrough was so devastating and so remarkable. The man investigators had searched for was not waiting somewhere to be found. He had already disappeared from the world. But a part of his biological identity had remained. And that was enough. There is a particular darkness to cold cases. The victim cannot speak. The witnesses may forget. The suspect may die. But the evidence can wait. For Karen Kloss, it waited for 4 decades. And when the answer finally emerged, it did not arrive with a dramatic confession. It arrived quietly. through databases, through genetic comparison, through a relative, through evidence collected on a terrible morning in 1976. That is what makes this case so haunting. For 41 years, Karen's killer had effectively been a ghost. Then science gave the ghost a name. And that name was Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The discovery also transformed the meaning of the old witness statement. For decades, the image of a shaggy-haired man in a trench coat and blue jeans had remained suspended in the public imagination. A stranger. A silhouette. A man walking away. Now investigators could connect that long-ago image to a real individual. The unknown man had not been imaginary. He had existed. He had been close enough to Karen to enter her home. And then he had walked away. That simple image became one of the most disturbing elements of the case. A man leaving. A neighborhood remaining quiet. A family waiting. And a mystery beginning. The investigation had once depended on human memory. In the end, it depended on genetics. That transformation represents the entire history of modern cold case investigation. The detectives of 1976 were not careless because they lacked today's technology. They were working in another forensic era. They collected what they could. They interviewed witnesses. They investigated suspects. They preserved biological evidence. They kept searching. And decades later, a new generation of investigators inherited their unfinished work. The detectives who eventually solved the case did not start from nothing. They stood on top of everything that had been preserved before them. Every old report. Every old interview. Every piece of biological evidence. Every unanswered question. The breakthrough was therefore not one miracle. It was 40 years of persistence converging with technology. And when investigators announced the identification in January 2017, Bill Medley stood beside members of law enforcement and his sons. He had spent decades waiting. He had wondered whether Karen's killer was alive. He had wondered whether the case would ever be solved. He had eventually tried to accept that the answer might never come. Then came the call. Authorities had identified the man believed responsible. Medley later described the experience as deeply unsettling, saying he had become numb when he learned the news. He also expressed relief that the family could finally close the chapter. But there was no courtroom ending. No jury. No verdict. No sentence. The suspect was already dead. And that created an unusual kind of closure. The investigation could establish who authorities believed committed the murder. But the legal system could not put him on trial. The final chapter was therefore written not by a judge, but by forensic evidence. A DNA profile. A familial connection. A confirmation. For decades compressed into a genetic match. That is why the Karen Kloss case remains one of the most extraordinary cold case stories in California. It demonstrates how a murder can become almost invisible without ever truly disappearing. It demonstrates how evidence can survive longer than memory. And it demonstrates how a family can spend decades living with a question that has no place to go. There is another detail that makes the case especially haunting. Karen's sons were only children when their mother was murdered. They did not simply lose a parent. They lost an entire future. The future of ordinary conversations. The future of family holidays. The future of watching their mother grow older. The future of introducing her to grandchildren. All of it vanished in one morning. Bill Medley later emphasized that the tragedy was not only the violence inflicted upon Karen. It was everything her children never got to experience with her. That is the real measure of a cold case. Not how long the file stayed open. Not how famous the victim became. Not how unusual the forensic breakthrough was. The real measure is the human time lost while everyone waited for an answer. Karen's case lasted 41 years. 41 years in which the world continued moving. Cars changed. Homes changed. Technology changed. Children became adults. The killer died. But Karen remained 32 forever. Her photograph remained frozen. Her voice existed only in memory. Her family continued without her. And somewhere in a laboratory, the biological evidence from that terrible morning waited for technology to become sophisticated enough to speak. When it finally did, it said one name: Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The title of this story suggests that an old jacket shattered the mystery. But the historical record tells a more precise story. The decisive breakthrough was not an old jacket. It was DNA evidence preserved from the crime scene, and a familial DNA search that eventually pointed investigators toward Troyer. That distinction matters. Because real cold cases are rarely solved by one cinematic object. They are solved by fragments. A witness statement. A preserved piece of evidence. An old photograph. A database entry. A relative. A forensic technique that did not exist when the crime happened. One fragment may mean nothing. Together they can become a map. And the map eventually led investigators back to a man who had been dead for 35 years. Troyer's death in 1982 had seemed to make the possibility of justice even more remote. He could not be questioned. He could not be followed. He could not be compared through the databases that later became standard. But death did not erase his genetic signature. That is the strange power of forensic science. Person can disappear. A biological trace can remain. And decades later the past can reopen. For Karen, the breakthrough came too late to save her. But it came early enough to answer the question her family had carried for most of their lives. Who killed Karen Kloss? Investigators said Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The mystery was solved. The cold case was closed. But the story did not end there. Because some questions can be answered without ever being healed. Why Karen? What exactly happened inside that home during those terrible moments? Was she targeted? Was the attack opportunistic? Did Troyer know her? Was he watching the neighborhood? Did he enter by chance? Some details may never be known with certainty. The person who could have answered them was dead. And that leaves the final silence. The silence of a home in Hermosa Beach. The silence after a woman failed to meet her friends. The silence before neighbors realized something was terribly wrong. The silence that followed for 41 years. And then finally the announcement. A name. A killer identified. A family able to stop wondering whether the truth would ever emerge. But Karen's story is not really about the man who killed her. It is about the woman whose life was interrupted. Karen Kloss was 32. She was a mother. She had 2 sons. She had friends. She had a history before the crime. She had a future that should have lasted decades. The murder reduced that enormous life to a single date in a case file. The eventual investigation restored something that had been missing from the record for 41 years. Her story had an ending. Not a happy one. Not a perfect one. But an answer. And sometimes, in the darkest cold cases, an answer is the closest thing a family can receive to justice. The old evidence did not speak for 40 years. Then it did. The database did not know the killer's name. Then it found his family. The killer could not be arrested. He was already dead. But the truth did not die with him. It was waiting. Waiting inside evidence. Waiting inside DNA. Waiting inside the scientific possibility that one day investigators would have a way to connect the invisible biological signature, left behind in 1976 with a family member living decades later. That is how a case that seemed destined to remain unsolved finally broke open. Not with a scream. Not with a confession. Not with a suspect walking through a police station. With science. With patience. With evidence that refused to disappear. And with a name that had been hidden for more than 4 decades. Karen Kloss went home that morning expecting an ordinary day. Instead, she became the center of one of California's most enduring cold cases. Her killer walked away. The years followed. The investigation stalled. The witnesses grew older. The suspect died. But the evidence remained. And 41 years later, the silence was finally broken. The mystery had a name. The family finally had an answer. And the case of Karen Kloss, which had once seemed destined to remain forever frozen in the past, finally reached the only ending a cold case can hope for. The truth. Not because time healed the wound. Time never did. Not because justice arrived in a courtroom. It never could. But because after 41 years, the evidence finally told investigators what the people who loved Karen had been waiting to hear. Who did it? And in the quiet after the announcement, one fact remained impossible to escape. Karen Kloss should have lived. Her son should have grown up with her. Her future should have continued. Instead, 41 years of unanswered questions ended with a man who had been dead for decades. The killer was gone. The evidence remained. And Karen's name, after years buried beneath the weight of an unsolved murder, finally emerged from the darkness. The case was no longer a question. It was a history. A tragedy. A warning. And a reminder that sometimes the past does not stay buried. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes the smallest trace survives. And sometimes, decades after everyone has stopped expecting an answer, the evidence speaks. Karen Kloss was finally heard. The name Kenneth Eugene Troyer changed the shape of the investigation, but it did not erase the darkness surrounding that January morning in Hermosa Beach. For 41 years, Karen Kloss had remained trapped inside a moment that the rest of the world had moved far beyond. Her sons grew up. Her former husband became internationally known. The detectives who had first walked into the case grew older and retired. Some died. The neighborhood changed. Technology transformed the way investigators understood crime scenes. But the question remained. Who had entered Karen's home? Who had attacked her? Who had left her fighting for her life? And why had that person remained unidentified for so long? In 1976, investigators did not have the luxury of looking backward through a nationwide genetic database. There was no digital map of human DNA waiting to be searched. A biological sample could be collected and preserved, but its power was limited by the technology available at the time. The evidence could tell investigators that an unknown person had been involved. Could not give them a name. That distinction would haunt the case for decades. Karen's murder had already produced a description of a possible suspect. Witnesses reported seeing a man in the area around the time of the attack. He was described as having shaggy hair and a beard and wearing a trench coat and blue jeans. To investigators in 1976, that description was important. But California was filled with men who could have fit it. The image was too broad. The memory was too fragile. And every passing year made it harder to know whether the witnesses were remembering what they had actually seen, or what they had reconstructed in their minds after hearing details repeated over and over. Still, investigators refused to simply erase the case. Karen's name remained in the files. Her death remained classified as a homicide. The physical evidence remained valuable. And somewhere in the background, the possibility existed that science might one day provide what traditional police work could not. Then DNA changed criminal investigations forever. Suddenly, biological material that had once been little more than a forensic curiosity could become an identifying signature. A person could leave behind microscopic evidence without realizing it. Blood. Saliva. skin cells, other biological material. The body could leave a fingerprint without ever touching ink. And in Karen's case, investigators had biological evidence connected to the crime. Testing eventually produced a DNA profile. That should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it created another mystery. The profile belonged to an unknown male. But the unknown male was not in the database. The evidence was real. The profile was real. The killer was still unidentified. Imagine the frustration. Detectives had something more powerful than the original investigators could ever have dreamed of. They had a genetic signature. But the name attached to that signature did not exist in the system. The case had crossed into a new era without actually being solved. This is where many cold cases die. Not because investigators stop caring. Not because evidence disappears. But because the evidence reaches the limits of the technology available to interpret it. For Karen, that limitation lasted years. The profile could eliminate suspects. It could establish that investigators were looking at the wrong people. But it could not tell them who had actually committed the murder. The investigation therefore continued through elimination. People connected to Karen were examined. Potential suspects were considered. Some were cleared. Others remained part of the historical record of the case. But no one could be charged. No one could be taken to trial. The killer remained outside the reach of the justice system. And then there was the most painful possibility of all. Perhaps the killer was still alive. Perhaps he was living somewhere in California. Perhaps he had moved across the country. Perhaps he had built a family. Perhaps he was an ordinary-looking man walking through an ordinary town while carrying an extraordinary secret. That possibility haunted the case. Because Karen's family had no way of knowing whether the person responsible for destroying their lives was still walking among them. Then investigators discovered something that made the case even more complicated. The DNA evidence did not point toward a living suspect. It pointed toward a man who had been dead for decades. Kenneth Eugene Troyer had been involved in serious criminal activity before his death. He had been imprisoned. He escaped from a California prison in 1982. He was later involved in additional violent crimes and was ultimately shot and killed by police that same year. By the time investigators connected him to Karen's murder, Troyer had been dead for approximately 35 years. That meant there would be no interrogation. No confession. No dramatic arrest. No courtroom confrontation. The person who might have been able to explain what happened had already disappeared into history. But the discovery did something even more important. It confirmed that the mysterious DNA profile had not been an abstract forensic clue. It belonged to a real person. And that person had been in Karen's life at the precise moment her life was destroyed. The identification came through a familial DNA investigation. This was the crucial shift. Investigators did not initially find Troyer by simply typing his name into a database. They found a genetic connection through another person. A relative's DNA profile entered the system after that relative became involved in a later qualifying criminal case. The genetic relationship provided investigators with a direction. Instead of asking, "Who is this unknown man?" they could ask a different question. Which family could this unknown man belong to? That is a radically different investigation. The search moves from an endless population to a family tree. One branch. Then another. A surname. A generation. Possible suspect. A dead man. And finally a comparison. Investigators obtained a sample associated with Troyer from the Orange County Coroner's Office. The DNA was tested. The result connected Troyer to the biological evidence from Karen's murder. The mystery that had survived 41 years suddenly became a historical fact. But the emotional impact of that discovery was complicated. Because there is a difference between solving a murder and delivering justice. A murder can be solved after the killer is dead. A family can learn the identity of the person responsible. Investigators can close the file. But a courtroom cannot hear a dead defendant. A jury cannot examine him. A judge cannot sentence him. The legal process cannot provide the ending that many families imagine when they dream of a cold case finally being solved. Instead, Karen's family received something both smaller and enormous. An answer. For decades, uncertainty had been part of their lives. Was the killer alive? Would he ever be identified? Would investigators ever know what happened? Could Karen's death remain unexplained forever? Those questions had no answers. Now one of them did. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The name transformed the case. It also transformed the meaning of the old evidence. A towel. Biological material. Witness descriptions. Old investigative reports. The DNA profile. All of these pieces had existed separately. Now they could be connected. That is the strange architecture of a cold case. The pieces may be visible for decades without forming a picture. Then one new piece arrives. Suddenly everything changes. For investigators, Troyer's identification represented the culmination of years of forensic progress. For Karen's family, it represented something much more personal. They could finally stop asking whether someone would ever be held responsible. The answer was that the responsible man was already gone. But at least they knew. And knowing matters. Because uncertainty can be its own form of suffering. A family can mourn a death. But when a murder remains unsolved, mourning becomes entangled with suspicion. Every possibility remains open. Every stranger becomes potentially relevant. Every unanswered question can return at night. Was he still alive? Was he watching the news? Did he know the family was still searching? Did he ever think about Karen? Did he ever regret what he had done? The family could never know. And even after Troyer's identification, some of those questions remained permanently unanswered. That is the final cruelty of a dead suspect. The investigation can identify him. Science can connect him to the crime. But science cannot recreate his thoughts. It cannot tell investigators what he intended. It cannot explain every movement inside the house. It cannot provide a confession. It can only establish the connection between the man and the evidence. Everything beyond that remains inside the darkness. The case therefore became a study in what modern forensic science can and cannot do. DNA can identify. DNA can exclude. DNA can connect. But DNA cannot resurrect the dead. It cannot restore a mother to 2 children. It cannot give Karen back the years that were taken from her. And it cannot answer every question surrounding a violent crime. What it can do is something incredibly important. It can prevent the truth from disappearing completely. Karen's case is proof. The investigation survived because evidence survived. The biological trace did not care that decades passed. It did not care that the original detectives retired. It did not care that the suspect died. The evidence waited. And eventually investigators had the tools to understand it. That is why the passage of time in a cold case can be deceptive. 40 years may appear to destroy an investigation. But sometimes 40 years simply separate the crime from the technology capable of solving it. The case of Karen Kloss demonstrates that difference with brutal clarity. The murder happened in 1976. The killer died in 1982. The identity was established in 2017. 3 different eras. 1 crime. 1 biological signature connecting them all. And somewhere between those dates was the life Karen never got to live. Her sons were children when she died. By the time the case was solved, they were adults. The little boys who had once needed their mother had spent most of their lives without her. They had no chance to grow up with her. No chance to ask her questions as adults. No chance to hear her stories again. No chance to introduce their children to her. Time had given them adulthood. It had not given them their mother back. That is why the eventual identification could feel like both relief and grief at the same time. The mystery was gone. The loss remained. And perhaps that is the most important distinction in any cold case. Closure does not mean forgetting. Closure does not mean the pain disappears. Closure means the unanswered question finally has an answer. Karen was murdered. Her killer was identified. His name was Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The evidence that connected him to the crime had survived for decades. And although Troyer could never face a jury, his identity could no longer hide behind the passage of time. For 41 years he had been an unknown man. A description. A silhouette. Possibility. Then the DNA gave that silhouette a face. It gave the investigators a name. And it gave Karen's family the truth. But there was still one final question hanging over the case. How had the killer managed to remain invisible for so long? The answer was not that investigators had forgotten Karen. It was that the killer had benefited from the limitations of his era. He died before modern DNA databases could expose him. He disappeared before familial searching became a powerful investigative tool. He left behind evidence that could identify him only after science had evolved. His greatest shield was not necessarily intelligence. It was time. And for decades time appeared to be winning. Then science turned time against him. The biological evidence became stronger with every technological advancement. The databases became larger. The search methods became more sophisticated. The possibility of familial matching transformed unidentified profiles from dead ends into investigative leads. And eventually the past caught up. The killer had been dead for decades. But the case was alive. The evidence was alive. Karen's name was still alive. And the question was still alive. Until one day the answer arrived. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But decisively. The unknown man was no longer unknown. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. A name written into the case file. A name that could finally be spoken when Karen's murder was discussed. A name that could finally replace the phrase unknown suspect. A name that ended one of California's most persistent cold case mysteries. But the ocean near Hermosa Beach continued to move. The streets continued to fill with people. The houses continued to stand. Life continued. And perhaps that is what makes the story so haunting. A murder can freeze one family in time while the rest of the world keeps moving. Karen's life stopped. Everyone else's continued. For 4 decades, the investigation moved slowly through that enormous distance between tragedy and truth. Then suddenly the distance disappeared. One DNA connection. One family relationship. One deceased suspect. One answer. And the case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally emerged from the darkness. But Karen was still missing from the world. That fact could never change. The science could identify her killer. It could not identify all the moments that disappeared with her. The birthdays. The conversations. The photographs that were never taken. The ordinary mornings. The ordinary arguments. The ordinary laughter. The ordinary life. Those things cannot be recovered through forensic evidence. They exist only in memory. And memory, unlike DNA, fades. That is why preserving evidence matters. Because memory can disappear. Witnesses can die. Suspects can die. Communities can change. But a preserved trace can remain. Karen's case became a demonstration of that principle. The evidence survived long enough for the future to understand it. And when the future finally arrived, the truth was waiting. Not the entire truth. Perhaps never the entire truth. But enough. Enough to identify the man responsible. Enough to end the mystery. Enough to tell Karen's sons that the person who took their mother had finally been identified. And enough to ensure that the case would never again be described simply as an unsolved murder. The name Karen Kloss had been connected to a mystery for decades. Now it was connected to an answer. The cold case had finally warmed. And somewhere in the archives, the old evidence that had once seemed almost silent had become the loudest witness of all. There was a strange irony in the way the Karen Kloss investigation finally ended. The case had survived because people refused to let it disappear. But the man responsible had survived only long enough to die before anyone could name him. Kenneth Eugene Troyer had been gone since 1982. For most of the next 35 years, nobody looking at Karen's case knew that the man they were searching for had already left the world. That single fact changed the emotional landscape of the investigation. If Troyer had still been alive, the discovery might have triggered an arrest, an interrogation, a search warrant, a courtroom battle. Instead, investigators were left standing at the end of a road that had no prison cell. There was only a name. Only evidence. Only history. And yet, that name mattered. For Karen's sons, it meant the uncertainty was finally over. For investigators, it meant years of work had finally produced an identification. For the public, it meant another seemingly impossible cold case had been solved. But behind the headlines was a much quieter reality. A family had been waiting. They had waited through decades when there was no reason to believe the mystery would ever end. In 1976, the murder had been immediate. The shock was immediate. The investigation was immediate. But grief was not. Grief stretched across decades. Karen's sons had to grow up carrying a loss they could never explain completely. They were children when their mother died. They became teenagers. Young adults. Adults. Their lives moved through stages she was never there to witness. The world kept giving them new memories. But every new memory contained an absence. A mother who should have been there. A voice that could not be heard. A person who should have occupied a place at family gatherings, but instead existed only in photographs and stories. And while they were growing older, investigators continued trying to understand what had happened to her. That is what makes cold cases different from ordinary mysteries. They do not remain frozen. They evolve. The people connected to them change. The evidence is re-examined. Technology advances. New investigators inherit old files. And sometimes a clue that meant almost nothing in one decade becomes decisive in another. The Karen Kloss case followed exactly that path. The first investigators had witness statements. They had a crime scene. They had physical evidence. They had suspicions. But they did not have the ability to turn biological material into a searchable identity. Years later, DNA technology changed that. Suddenly, the crime scene could produce a genetic profile. The killer was no longer merely an unknown man described by witnesses. He had become an invisible biological signature. That was an enormous advance. But it was still not enough. The profile did not immediately identify anyone. It sat inside the system without a name. A silent marker. An unanswered question encoded in genetics. This is where the public often misunderstands cold case DNA investigations. People imagine that once investigators have DNA, the killer is automatically identified. It does not work that way. DNA can be extraordinarily powerful. But it must be compared against something. A suspect. A database profile. A relative. Another crime scene. A known sample. Without a comparison, DNA can remain anonymous. That was Karen's situation. Investigators had a biological profile. But no name. And the years continued. The case remained unresolved. Then the databases grew. More offenders were entered. More genetic information became available. And investigators gained the ability to search not only for direct matches, but for potential relatives. That development changed the landscape. An unknown offender did not necessarily need to have been arrested before. A close family member might be enough to open the door. That is what happened here. A relative of Troyer entered the criminal justice system decades after Karen's death. His genetic information became part of the searchable system. The result was not an immediate declaration. It was a lead. Connection. Possibility. Investigators followed it. They traced the genetic relationship. They examined Troyer's history. They compared the timeline. They looked at where he had been. They examined what investigators already knew about the Karen Kloss case. The old witness description suddenly gained new significance. The man described decades earlier had characteristics consistent with Troyer. The timeline could be examined. The history could be reconstructed. And then came the most important step. The DNA. Investigators obtained a reference sample associated with Troyer. The laboratory comparison linked that sample to the biological evidence preserved from Karen's murder. After more than 4 decades, the unknown suspect had a name. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. That moment would have been impossible in 1976. It would have been impossible for investigators to make that identification with the tools available at the time. But technology does not remain still. The science of forensic genetics evolved. And Karen's evidence survived long enough to benefit from it. There is something almost unsettling about that. The case had been waiting for the future. The future finally arrived. And it brought the answer with it. But solving the mystery also raised difficult questions about what justice means when the person responsible is already dead. Troyer could not be prosecuted. There would be no trial. No jury would hear the evidence. No defense attorney would challenge the DNA. No prosecutor would present the history of the case. There would be no sentencing hearing. Instead, investigators announced their conclusion based on forensic evidence. That was enough to close the investigative question. But not enough to create the traditional ending that crime stories often promise. The story did not end with a prison door. It ended with a confirmation. And perhaps that was the only ending available. Troyer's death had already happened decades earlier. The justice system could not change that. But history could. History could record his connection to Karen's murder. History could ensure that Karen's death was no longer an unsolved mystery. History could preserve the truth for future generations. And that mattered. Because before the identification, the case carried another possibility. Maybe the killer would never be known. Maybe the truth would disappear with the people who remembered the crime. Maybe Karen would remain one more name in a long list of victims whose killers were never identified. The DNA evidence prevented that. The killer could die. But he could not take the evidence with him. That is one of the most powerful realities of modern cold case investigation. The dead cannot destroy evidence. They cannot erase biological traces. They cannot control future technology. They cannot know what investigators will be capable of decades later. Troyer died believing, if he ever thought about the case at all, that his secret was buried. But it was not. The evidence remained. And the evidence eventually found him. There is no way to know what Troyer thought after Karen's murder. There is no reliable record explaining his motives. There is no courtroom testimony in which he described his actions. There is no confession explaining why Karen was attacked. Those questions remain in the darkness. And they may stay there forever. But the central question was answered. Who was responsible? Investigators identified Troyer. And that answer transformed Karen's case from an unsolved mystery into a solved homicide. Still, the old witness description remains haunting. A man. Shaggy hair. Beard. Trench coat. Blue jeans. Walking away. For years, that image had existed without a name. A stranger moving through the neighborhood. A figure disappearing into the ordinary world. Now the image could be connected to a real person. That connection is disturbing because it reminds us how close the killer may have been to the world around Karen. He was not a supernatural figure. He was not an invisible monster. He was a human being. He had a history. He had a body. He had relatives. He had DNA. And that DNA remained behind. The case therefore became a lesson in how ordinary human biology can become extraordinary evidence. A microscopic trace can outlive a human life. A tiny fragment can cross decades. It can survive changes in technology. It can survive changes in police departments. It can survive the death of the person who left it. And eventually it can speak. Karen's case also exposes another uncomfortable truth. Cold cases are not simply old crimes. They are unfinished stories. Every year that passes without an answer creates another layer. The victim ages only in photographs. The family ages in real life. The investigators retire. The suspect may die. The community forgets. But the case remains unfinished. That is why every cold case breakthrough feels almost like an interruption in time. Investigators open an old file. They examine evidence collected decades earlier. They look at a photograph taken when today's technology did not exist. They read statements written by people who may no longer be alive. And suddenly the past becomes present. Karen's murder became present again in 2017. A case that had been dormant for decades returned to the headlines. The name Karen Kloss appeared again. The Righteous Brothers connection appeared again. The old photograph appeared again. The question appeared again. Who killed Karen? This time investigators had the answer. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The name ended one mystery. But it also opened a window into the limitations of justice. Because there is something fundamentally incomplete about solving a murder after the killer has died. There is no confrontation. No explanation. No apology. No final statement. The victim's family cannot look the offender in the eyes. The offender cannot hear the impact of his crime described by those he harmed. The courtroom cannot deliver the final judgment. All that remains is evidence. And evidence is cold. Does not cry. It does not forgive. It does not forget. It simply establishes connections. In Karen's case, that connection was enough to tell investigators what they needed to know. The biological evidence pointed toward Troyer. The historical record supported the identification. The investigation reached its conclusion. And the case could finally be closed. But for the family, the word closed probably never meant what it does on a police document. A police file can be closed. A life cannot be reopened. A childhood cannot be restored. A mother cannot be returned. That is why the emotional ending of a cold case rarely matches the administrative ending. The police may write solved. The family may still feel the loss. The community may still remember. And the victim remains gone. Karen's story is therefore not simply about forensic science. It is about time. Time can bury evidence. But sometimes it preserves it. Time can weaken memories. But sometimes it creates opportunities for new science. Time can allow a killer to die peacefully. But it can also allow investigators to identify him after death. Time does not always erase. Sometimes it reveals. 41 years had passed between Karen's murder and the identification of Troyer. 41 years is long enough for an entire generation to be born and grow up. Long enough for children to become parents. Long enough for technology to transform society. Long enough for people to believe that a mystery has become permanent. And yet the answer was still there. Waiting. The biological evidence had been collected in 1976. It had survived. The killer's genetic signature had survived. The investigation survived. Karen's name survived. And eventually, all of those surviving pieces collided. The result was an identification. A name. An ending. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story is what will never be known. What happened during the final moments of Karen's consciousness? What did she see? What did she hear? Did she recognize the person attacking her? Did she realize she was in danger? Did she believe someone would come? Did she know her sons would eventually grow up without her? These are questions that forensic science cannot answer. And because Troyer died before investigators could confront him, the answers may have disappeared forever. That is the final boundary of every cold case. Evidence can tell us what happened. Sometimes it can tell us who did it. But it cannot always tell us why. The why remains human. And humans die. Karen's killer took that explanation with him. All investigators could recover was his identity. And sometimes that is the most the past is willing to give. The story of Karen Kloss began with an ordinary morning. It ended with a forensic breakthrough decades later. Between those 2 points was a lifetime that should have existed. Karen should have watched her sons grow. She should have seen the world change. She should have lived through the decades that eventually solved her own murder. Instead, the technology that identified her killer arrived long after she was gone. That is both tragic and strangely hopeful. Tragic because science could not save her. Hopeful because science eventually prevented her case from disappearing. And perhaps that is why cold case investigators continue opening old files. Because every unresolved case contains the possibility that the answer is still there. Hidden in evidence. Hidden in a database. Hidden in a family connection. Hidden in something investigators once collected but could not interpret. The past may be silent. But it is not always empty. Sometimes buried beneath decades of dust, there is still a voice. Karen's voice cannot be heard directly. But the evidence left behind spoke for her. Spoke through genetics. Spoke through science. And after 41 years, it finally gave investigators the name of the man responsible. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. A name that had been unknown when Karen died. A name that had remained invisible while her sons grew up. A name that appeared only after the technology of the future reached backward into the evidence of the past. The killer was dead. The mystery was not. The mystery waited. And eventually the evidence answered. There are moments in a cold case when the past seems to breathe again. A detective opens a file that has been closed for years. A photograph slides across a desk. A handwritten report describes a morning that happened before many of the people reading it were even born. And somewhere among those pages is the name of a woman whose life ended violently. Karen Kloss. For decades, her murder existed in that strange space between memory and history. People knew what had happened. They knew she had been attacked. They knew she had died. They knew investigators had searched. They knew witnesses had seen something. They knew evidence existed. But they did not know who had done it. That missing name transformed the entire case. It meant the killer remained an unknown figure. It meant every theory could survive. It meant every new detective had to begin by confronting the same wall that had defeated the investigators before them. An unidentified offender. A biological profile without a name. A family waiting for an answer. The case had become a race against time. But time had already taken almost everything from it. the original investigators had only the technology of their generation. They could document the scene. They could photograph injuries. They could collect physical evidence. They could interview witnesses. They could compare fingerprints when fingerprints existed. But the science that would eventually identify Karen's killer was still decades away from becoming a routine investigative tool. In 1976, DNA profiling as investigators know it today did not exist. That meant biological evidence could be preserved without anyone fully understanding how valuable it might become. This is one of the great ironies of forensic history. Sometimes investigators preserve evidence without knowing whether it will ever become useful. They simply know that it might matter. And in Karen's case, that decision mattered enormously. The biological material connected to the crime survived. The years passed. The killer did not confess. The case did not disappear. And then the forensic revolution arrived. DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations. Instead of relying entirely on eyewitnesses or circumstantial evidence, investigators could begin examining biological material at the molecular level. Every person carries a genetic identity. That identity can be transferred through physical contact. A criminal can attempt to clean a crime scene. He can hide weapons. He can change his appearance. He can move away. He can even die. But the biological traces he leaves behind may remain. Karen's killer could not know what science would eventually become capable of. He could not know that decades later, investigators would be able to examine evidence collected in the 1970s and extract a profile from it. He could not know that a relative might someday place his family inside a genetic database. He could not know that investigators would eventually use that connection to reconstruct a path toward him. And that is exactly what happened. The breakthrough was not immediate. It required patience. It required investigators to revisit evidence that had already been tested. It required new technology. It required databases. It required a family connection. And it required detectives willing to follow a lead that began with someone who was not the killer. This is the power of familial DNA searching. A direct match asks a simple question. Does this DNA belong to the suspect? A familial search asks something more complicated. Could this DNA belong to a close relative of someone already in the system? That difference can turn a dead end into a direction. In Karen's case, the direction eventually pointed toward the Troyer family. Investigators began examining Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The man had a violent history. He had spent time in prison. He escaped. He was later involved in other violent offenses. And then he died in 1982 after being shot by police. The timeline suddenly became chilling. Karen had been murdered in 1976. Troyer was alive. He was in California. He fit the investigative profile closely enough to warrant further examination. And now, decades later, his genetic identity was connected to the crime scene. The evidence was no longer simply pointing toward an unknown male. It was pointing toward Troyer. Investigators obtained a reference sample associated with him. The comparison produced the confirmation they had been waiting for. The biological evidence from Karen's murder was linked to Kenneth Eugene Troyer. 41 years. That was how long it took. 41 years between the crime and the identification. The number itself is difficult to comprehend. 41 years is longer than many careers. Longer than some marriages. Long enough for an entire generation to grow up. Long enough for the little boys who lost their mother to become men. Long enough for the suspect to die. Long enough for the technology of investigation to change completely. And still the case had not forgotten. Karen's name remained attached to the evidence. The evidence remained attached to the crime. And eventually the crime was attached to a name. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. For investigators, that was the end of an extraordinary search. For Karen's family, It was the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. Because identifying the killer forces a family to confront the reality that the person they had imagined for decades now has a face, a history, a name, a life, and a death. The unknown figure who had existed only in nightmares became a real man. That can be difficult to process. For years, families of homicide victims sometimes imagine their loved one's killer in abstract terms. A shadow, a monster, a stranger, a person without a face. Then an investigation gives that person a name. The imagination becomes reality. In Karen's case, reality was even stranger because the killer was already dead. There was no confrontation waiting. There was no possibility of seeing him enter a courtroom. There was no possibility of hearing his version of events. The discovery therefore carried a peculiar finality. Troyer could never speak. He could never deny the evidence. He could never explain himself. He could never tell investigators what happened inside Karen's home. And he could never tell her family why. The questions therefore remained divided. The central question had been answered. Who? Kenneth Eugene Troyer. But the deeper questions remained. Why? What happened? Was Karen targeted? Was the crime planned? Did Troyer know her? What exactly happened during those final moments? Those questions may never have answers. The man who could potentially have answered them was gone. This is where the case becomes more than a forensic success story. It becomes a story about the limits of justice. Modern technology can reach backward. But it cannot travel all the way back. It cannot resurrect witnesses. It cannot reconstruct every thought. It cannot replay the final minutes of a victim's life with perfect accuracy. It can identify. It can connect. It can establish. But it cannot restore. That distinction is important. Because when a cold case is solved, headlines often announce that justice has finally been served. Sometimes that is emotionally true. But legally, the situation may be very different. Troyer was never convicted in Karen's murder. He never stood trial. The identification came after his death. So the final judgment existed primarily in the investigative record. The evidence established the connection. The family received the answer. The public learned the identity. But the courtroom remained empty. And that empty courtroom is part of the story. It reminds us that solving a murder and prosecuting a murderer are not the same thing. One can happen decades after the other becomes impossible. That is what happened here. The case was solved. The killer could not be tried. And Karen's family had to live with both truths at once. There was relief. There was grief. There was anger. There was perhaps even disbelief. After 41 years, the mystery was no longer a mystery. But the person responsible had been dead for 35 years. The news could not change the past. It could only change the understanding of it. And sometimes that is what cold case investigators are really fighting for. Not to change what happened. That is impossible. They fight to establish what happened. To separate fact from speculation. To give a victim back the truth that violence tried to take away. Karen's story had been distorted by decades of uncertainty. Rumors could grow. Theories could change. People could be suspected and later cleared. But the DNA evidence remained stable. It did not depend on memory. It did not depend on reputation. It did not depend on a witness being certain 40 years later. It was biological evidence. That gave the final identification extraordinary significance. The science could stand where memory had weakened. And the investigation could finally move beyond the question of who might have done it. The name had been found. The unknown man had become known. And the old witness description suddenly seemed like something more than a vague clue. It was part of the historical path leading toward Troyer. The man had existed in the right place. He had been alive at the right time. His history contained violence. And his DNA was connected to the crime. For decades earlier, investigators could not have made that chain. In 2017, they could. That is what progress looks like in a cold case. Not necessarily a dramatic new clue. Sometimes it is an old clue interpreted with new technology. The evidence does not change. The ability to understand it changes. Karen's case is a perfect example. The biological trace was old. The crime scene was old. The reports were old. The victim's photograph was old. The suspect was dead. But the technology was new. And new technology looked at old evidence differently. Suddenly, the case was no longer trapped in 1976. It had entered the 21st century. That is why the story of Karen Kloss continued to matter long after the original investigation had slowed. It demonstrated that a case can remain viable, even when conventional leads have disappeared. It demonstrated that evidence can outlive investigators. And it demonstrated that a killer can lose the advantage of time. For decades, Troyer's death had effectively protected his identity. He could not be questioned. He could not be found. He could not be watched. He was gone. But death was not enough to erase the evidence. The biological trace remained. And when investigators finally connected it to him, the fact of his death became almost irrelevant to the central mystery. He was gone. But the evidence was not. That is the terrifying beauty of forensic science. A person can disappear completely. A molecule cannot forget. Karen's family did not receive a perfect ending. They received something more complicated. They received truth. The truth that a man named Kenneth Eugene Troyer was identified as responsible for Karen's murder. The truth that the mystery had an answer. The truth that the killer was no longer an unknown stranger. And the truth that he had died years before the answer arrived. That last fact is perhaps the most haunting. Imagine spending decades wondering whether the killer is still alive. Then discovering that he had been dead for decades. The danger you feared was already gone. But the fear had been real. The uncertainty had been real. The pain had been real. And none of that disappears simply because the mystery is solved. That is why cold cases leave such long shadows. The victim's death happens once. The uncertainty happens again and again. Every anniversary. Every family gathering. Every news story about an unsolved murder. Every time someone asks whether there has been an update. Every time a detective calls and says there is nothing new. The case lives inside those moments. Then suddenly the phone rings with different news. There is a name. There is a match. There is an answer. But the years cannot be returned. Karen cannot return. The family cannot return to 1976. The children cannot become children again. And the suspect cannot be brought into the courtroom. The only thing that can move forward is the truth. And truth in this case moved very slowly. Took 41 years. But it arrived. That is why the Karen Kloss murder remains so haunting. The killer did not defeat the investigation. He outlived its technology. For a while that looked like the same thing. It was not. The evidence was still there. The case was still there. And eventually the technology caught up. A family connection opened the door. A forensic comparison confirmed the identity. A dead man's name emerged from the genetic trail. And the cold case finally stopped being a mystery. Yet even after the identification, one image remains stronger than any laboratory result. A quiet California neighborhood. A woman who had no idea that her ordinary morning was about to become the last morning of her life. A man leaving the area. A family waiting for her to return. A phone call that changed everything. And then decades of silence. That silence lasted longer than anyone expected. But it did not last forever. Because somewhere inside the preserved evidence was the smallest possible record of the truth. And 41 years later, investigators finally learned how to read it. The strange thing about an investigation that lasts 40 years is that the crime itself can become almost impossible to imagine. The people who lived through it remember the shock. The detectives remember the files. The family remembers the woman. But for everyone else, 1976 becomes a distant place. A different America. A different California. A world before smartphones. Before social media. Before modern forensic databases. Before investigators could send a genetic profile through sophisticated systems and wait for a relative to appear. Karen's murder happened in that world. And that is why the first investigation depended so heavily on people. People had to remember. People had to recognize. People had to speak. People had to notice something unusual. And people could be wrong. A witness might remember a beard but forget the shape of a face. Someone might remember a coat but not the color of the shirt underneath. Someone might remember a stranger leaving the area, but not know whether that person had anything to do with the violence inside the house. Investigators had to assemble a picture from fragments. And every fragment carried uncertainty. That uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the case. There was no single witness who could walk into a police station and say with absolute certainty, "That is the man." There was no photograph capturing the suspect clearly. There was no modern surveillance system recording every movement through the neighborhood. There was simply an investigation unfolding in real time after a devastating crime. Karen was 32 years old. She had 2 sons. Her life had already been shaped by marriage, motherhood, friendships, and the ordinary routines of Southern California. She had once been married to Bill Medley, who would become famous as a member of the Righteous Brothers. That connection brought an unusual amount of public attention to the case. But fame could not solve the murder. It could only make the unanswered questions louder. People wanted to know who had done this. They wanted to know why. They wanted to know whether Karen had been targeted. They wanted to know whether the killer was someone she knew. They wanted to know whether the person responsible was still walking free. Every theory had the same weakness. There was no definitive identification. The investigation therefore became an exercise in exclusion. Suspects were examined. Some were eliminated. Others faded from consideration. The DNA evidence eventually became powerful enough to clear people who had once been considered possible suspects. That was important. But clearing the innocent did not identify the guilty. And this distinction can become almost unbearable in a long-running homicide investigation. The family does not need to know who did not do it. They need to know who did. For years, investigators could only narrow the field. They could not reach the final name. Then came the development that changed the case. The DNA profile. At first, the profile was simply another unknown. A genetic signature without a person attached to it. But unlike a witness, the DNA did not become less reliable with age. It did not forget. It did not change its story. The biological evidence recovered from the investigation remained what it had always been. What changed was the technology surrounding it. The databases became larger. The methods became more sophisticated. And investigators began looking beyond direct matches. That was when the case entered an entirely new phase. Familial DNA searching can feel almost like detective work performed through a microscope. Instead of asking for the exact person, investigators search for a biological relationship. Parent. A sibling. A child. Another close relative. The search does not automatically prove guilt. creates a lead. But a lead can be enough. One relative can become the thread that investigators pull. And if they keep pulling, the thread can lead to an entire family tree. That is what happened in Karen's case. A genetic connection eventually directed investigators toward Kenneth Eugene Troyer. Troyer's name was not random. His history mattered. His location mattered. His age mattered. His criminal history mattered. And most importantly, the biological evidence mattered. Investigators now had a candidate whose life could be compared against the facts known about Karen's murder. The pieces were beginning to align. Troyer had been alive in 1976. He was in California. He had a history that made the possibility of violent behavior impossible to ignore. And his genetic profile could be tested against the evidence preserved from the crime. The final comparison was decisive. The DNA associated with Troyer was linked to the biological evidence from the crime. The man investigators had been searching for since 1976 finally had a name. But there was something profoundly unsettling about that name. Kenneth Eugene Troyer was dead. He had been killed by police in 1982. The man who could have been interrogated had already disappeared decades earlier. The man who could have explained himself would never speak. The man who could have been prosecuted could never stand before a judge. That meant the discovery was both an ending and a limitation. The investigation could end. But the family's questions could not all be answered. The DNA could say, "This is the man connected to the evidence." It could not say, "This is why he did it." That missing word "why" is often the hardest word in a homicide. Why this victim? Why this moment? Why this level of violence? Was it planned? Was it opportunistic? Was Karen specifically targeted? Or did she simply become the victim of someone who crossed into her life for a few terrible minutes? The surviving evidence could establish a connection. It could not reconstruct every thought inside the killer's mind. And because Troyer was dead, there was no possibility of discovering those answers through interrogation. The case therefore stopped at a boundary. The identity was known. The motive remained uncertain. That distinction would remain forever. Still, the identification changed Karen's place in history. Before 2017, she was the victim of an unsolved murder. After 2017, she was the victim of a murder investigators had linked to a named suspect. That is not the same thing as bringing a killer to trial. But it is a profound difference for a family that spent decades living with uncertainty. There is a particular psychological weight carried by an unsolved homicide. When the perpetrator is unknown, the family may imagine that he is still somewhere in the world. Alive. Living. Breathing. Perhaps married. Perhaps raising children. Perhaps passing neighbors on the street. Perhaps watching television. Perhaps reading about the case. Perhaps knowing exactly what he had done. That possibility can become its own kind of torment. Karen's family had no way of knowing whether the man responsible was still alive. Then the identification changed that. He had been dead since 1982. The threat was not present anymore. The uncertainty had simply lasted long after the danger itself had ended. That revelation must have carried its own strange emotional force. The killer had not been hiding for 40 years. He had not spent 40 years escaping justice. He had died long before the world knew his name. The evidence had outlived him. That is one of the most important details in this case. Troyer's death did not erase his connection to Karen's murder. If anything, it made the forensic evidence even more important. There would be no confession. No statement. No explanation. The evidence had to carry the entire weight of the identification. And it did. This is why preserving evidence matters so much in cold cases. Investigators in 1976 could not have known what DNA technology would become. They could not have predicted familial searches. They could not have known how large genetic databases would eventually become. But they preserved evidence. And decades later, another generation of investigators could use it. That is not luck alone. It is institutional memory. A case survives when someone decides that the evidence is worth preserving. A murder remains solvable when investigators refuse to destroy the possibility of a future answer. Karen's case demonstrates that principle with unusual clarity. The crime was old. The evidence was old. The suspect was dead. But the investigation was still capable of producing a result. The discovery also exposed a cruel truth about time. Time is usually described as an enemy of justice.
Witnesses die.
Memories fade. Records disappear. Buildings are demolished. Communities change. But time can also create something. Technology. Every decade can bring new forensic tools, new databases, new analytical techniques, new ways of examining evidence that once seemed useless. So the same passage of time that weakens an investigation can also strengthen it. That contradiction sits at the center of Karen's story. 41 years made the witness memories older. But 41 years also made DNA technology dramatically more powerful. The past became harder to remember. The evidence became easier to interpret. Eventually, those two forces collided. And the killer's identity emerged. The public often remembers the moment a cold case is solved. But investigators remember the years before that moment. The failed leads. The unanswered calls. The old reports. The repeated reviews. The evidence that had been tested before. The questions that had already been asked. The possibility that the answer might never come. Those years matter. Because the final breakthrough can look sudden from the outside. It can appear as if someone simply discovered a name. But behind that name is often decades of accumulated work. Karen's case was no different. The final identification depended on evidence collected long before the investigators who solved the case were even involved. It depended on forensic technology that did not exist when Karen died. It depended on a database connection that could not have been made in 1976. And it depended on investigators willing to revisit a case that had already defeated multiple generations of detectives. The case was not solved because someone suddenly became lucky. It was solved because the investigation remained alive long enough for new science to reach it. That may be the most powerful lesson in the entire story. A cold case is not always a dead case. Sometimes it is simply a case waiting for the right technology. And Karen's murder waited a very long time. While the investigation waited, Karen's sons lived their lives. There is something deeply painful about imagining that passage of time. A 4-year-old child who once expected his mother to come home eventually became an adult. The years that followed were not theoretical. They were birthdays, school ceremonies, first jobs, relationships, failures, successes, moments when a mother would normally be called, moments when advice would normally be requested, moments when a child would instinctively look toward a parent. Karen was absent from all of them. The investigation could not change that. No DNA match could restore those lost years. No suspect identification could make the past happen differently. But the answer could change how the family understood the past. That matters because unresolved grief often contains uncertainty. The family knows someone was taken. But they do not know who took them. They know a crime happened. But they do not know why. They know the victim is gone. But they do not know whether the person responsible will ever be found. When the name Kenneth Eugene Troyer emerged, one of those uncertainties disappeared. The killer was no longer faceless. The family could finally place a human identity behind the crime. That does not mean they had every answer. It means the darkness had boundaries. There was a name. There was a history. There was evidence. There was a date of death. And there was a final acknowledgement from investigators that the case had been solved. For 41 years, the phrase unknown suspect had carried the weight of the entire investigation. Then that phrase disappeared. A name replaced it. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. The unknown became known. The question became fact. And the old evidence became the bridge between two generations of investigators. But the case still contained one final paradox. The killer had been dead for decades, yet his presence remained alive inside the investigation. His DNA was still there. His history was still there. His name was still recoverable. He had vanished physically. He had not vanished evidentially. That is why cold cases can be so haunting. The dead can remain present through what they leave behind. A fingerprint. A photograph. A weapon. A letter. A strand of hair. A biological trace. Piece of clothing. Something small. Something ordinary. Something that appears meaningless until technology or circumstance reveals its significance. In Karen's case, the evidence had waited for decades. And eventually, it became the strongest witness in the room. Could not speak. It could not describe the crime. It could not tell investigators what Karen felt. But it could establish a connection that memory could not erase. And once that connection was confirmed, the mystery changed forever. Karen Kloss was no longer an unnamed victim whose killer had disappeared into history. Her killer had a name. Her case had an answer. And the man responsible could no longer hide behind the passage of time. The ocean continued moving outside Hermosa Beach. People continued walking the same streets. Children who had not yet been born when Karen died eventually became adults. Technology continued advancing. And somewhere inside the archives of the investigation, the old evidence remained. Waiting. Because the truth had never disappeared. It had only been waiting for someone to know how to read it. The case of Karen Kloss had reached a point where the past and present seemed to exist at the same time. On one side was 1976. A young mother. 2 small children. A quiet California neighborhood. A brutal attack that transformed an ordinary morning into a nightmare. On the other side was 2017. A modern forensic laboratory. A database. A family connection. A dead man whose name had been buried for decades. Between those two worlds stretched 41 years of uncertainty. And somewhere inside that distance was the answer. But before investigators could reach that answer, the case had to survive the slow erosion that destroys so many cold investigations. Files can be misplaced. Evidence can deteriorate. Witnesses can die. Detectives can retire. People who once knew every detail can forget. Even communities can forget. The world has an extraordinary ability to move on. That may be one of the cruelest realities for families of homicide victims. The family remains emotionally connected to the day of the murder. The rest of society moves forward. For most people, a murder from 1976 becomes history. For Karen's sons, it remained personal. Every year that passed added another year to the absence. Karen did not age. Her sons did. That contrast can be devastating. Photographs preserve a person at one moment. Life continues around that photograph. A child grows taller. A teenager becomes an adult. An adult becomes a parent. And the person in the photograph remains the same age forever. Karen remained 32. Her sons carried the years she never received. And somewhere behind their lives was a question that had never been answered. Who killed their mother? The investigation had already produced a critical piece of information. The offender had left biological evidence. That evidence was preserved. Testing eventually produced a DNA profile. But a profile without a match is still an unanswered question. The investigators could hold the biological identity of the killer in their hands without knowing the killer's name. It is difficult to imagine the frustration. They had something more objective than a witness statement. Something more permanent than memory. Something capable of distinguishing one human being from millions. And yet the profile belonged to no one in the databases available to them. It was as if the killer had left his signature on the crime scene, but had written it in a language nobody could yet read. Then the language changed. Genetic databases expanded. Forensic science became more sophisticated. Investigators began using familial relationships to generate leads. And suddenly, an unknown profile could point toward a family. That is how an investigation that had been trapped for decades finally moved. The DNA did not simply produce a name. Produced a direction. Investigators followed the direction. The name Kenneth Eugene Troyer emerged. And then the old case began to look different. Troyer was not an abstract possibility. He was a real person. He had lived through the period surrounding Karen's murder. He had been involved in criminal activity. He had been incarcerated. He had escaped. He had later become involved in other violent offenses. And he had died in 1982. Every piece of his history suddenly became relevant. Investigators had to ask whether the timeline fit. They had to ask whether the physical evidence fit. They had to ask whether the DNA fit. And above everything else, they had to determine whether the biological evidence actually connected Troyer to Karen's murder. The answer was yes. That was the moment the case crossed a line it had never crossed before. Before that moment, investigators had an unknown killer. After it, they had a named suspect. The difference was enormous. For 4 decades, Karen's murder had been a mystery. Now investigators could reconstruct a much clearer history. The man connected to the DNA was someone who had been alive when Karen was killed. Someone who later became involved in violent crime. Someone who died years before the forensic breakthrough. The story was suddenly more coherent. But coherence is not the same thing as complete knowledge. The identification did not answer every question. It did not explain exactly what motivated Troyer. It did not reveal everything that happened inside Karen's home. It did not provide a transcript of the attack. And because Troyer was dead, there was no chance to ask him. The investigation therefore had to stop at what the evidence could establish. That limitation is important. In true crime storytelling, there is always a temptation to fill gaps. To create motives. To imagine conversations. To describe thoughts that were never documented. But the real case is often more unsettling because the gaps remain. Karen's killer was identified. His motive is not fully known. The evidence connected him to the crime. But it cannot tell us everything he was thinking. And that unanswered space is where the mystery continues to live. For Karen's family, however, the most important question had finally been answered. They knew who. That knowledge can change grief. Not eliminate it. Change it. An unsolved murder leaves the family trapped between grief and uncertainty. A solved murder can remove the uncertainty while leaving the grief intact. The pain does not vanish. The photographs do not change. The missing person does not return. But the family no longer has to imagine an unknown killer living somewhere in the world. That matters. For years, the killer could have been anyone. A stranger. A neighbor. A former acquaintance. Someone who had disappeared. Someone who had never been caught. The possibilities were endless. Then the possibilities collapsed into one name. Kenneth Eugene Troyer. He was not simply a name from the past. He was the man whose genetic evidence had connected him to Karen's murder. And because he was already dead, the identification carried a strange finality. There was no future investigation into where he might be. He could not flee. He could not destroy evidence. He could not change his appearance. He could not disappear again. He was already gone. What remained was the record. The record became the final confrontation. DNA against time. Evidence against silence. Science against the disappearance of memory. And science won. That is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Karen Kloss case. The killer had escaped the reach of investigators during his lifetime. But he did not escape the reach of evidence. His death had ended his physical existence. It had not ended the investigation. The DNA profile remained. The database remained. The family connection remained. And eventually the pieces converged. This is why cold case investigators often speak about preserving evidence. They understand that today's dead end can become tomorrow's breakthrough. A sample that seems unhelpful in one decade may become decisive in another. A fingerprint that cannot be matched today may be matched tomorrow. A DNA profile that produces no result may become valuable when a relative enters a database years later. The evidence does not need to solve the case immediately. It only needs to survive. Karen's evidence survived. That survival became the foundation of the eventual identification. And that fact gives the case an almost haunting sense of patience. The evidence waited longer than the killer lived. It waited longer than the original investigation remained active. It waited longer than the children remained children. It waited through decades of technological change. Then it finally spoke. There was another reason the case remained emotionally powerful. Karen was not simply a name in a police report. She had been known. She had relationships. She had children. She had a public connection to a famous musician. She had friends. She had a life that existed before the murder. The danger of cold case storytelling is that the victim can eventually become reduced to the crime. Karen became the woman who was murdered. But she had been much more than that. She had been a mother. She had been a friend. She had been a daughter. She had been a person with plans. The murder interrupted all of those identities. When investigators solved the case, they did more than identify a killer. They also restored some context to Karen's story. The investigation was no longer an unsolved mystery without an ending. It was a solved homicide involving a specific victim and a specific offender. That distinction matters. Because names matter. Karen's name mattered. Kenneth Eugene Troyer's name mattered. The evidence connected them. And the historical record preserved that connection. But the title of a cold case can never fully capture the human reality underneath. Karen Kloss murder. 3 words. Yet behind those words was an entire family. Behind them were 2 children. Behind them was a community. Behind them were investigators who spent years trying to understand what happened. Behind them was a killer whose identity remained hidden for more than 4 decades. And behind them was the long shadow of an unanswered question. The question did not disappear because people stopped caring. It disappeared temporarily beneath the weight of time. Then forensic science pulled it back into view. The old evidence became new again. The old case became current. The old name became headline news. And Karen's story returned to public attention. For investigators, the breakthrough was a triumph of forensic persistence. For the family, it was something much more complicated. Relief. Grief. Anger. Perhaps even a strange sense of disbelief. How can someone be both dead and finally found? How can a killer be identified when he can no longer be arrested? How can justice arrive decades after the person responsible is gone? There is no simple answer. Justice can take different forms. Sometimes it is a conviction. Sometimes it is a prison sentence. Sometimes it is a public acknowledgement of responsibility. In Karen's case, it was identification. The truth became official. The unknown became known. And the family could finally stop wondering whether the answer would ever come. But another thought remains disturbing. Troyer died in 1982. That means the mystery surrounding Karen lasted longer than the killer himself. The investigation continued after his death without anyone knowing that the person they sought was already buried somewhere. The police were looking for a living man. The answer was a dead man. That paradox explains why the case was so difficult. Traditional investigation assumes that a suspect can be found. But Troyer was beyond ordinary reach. No address. No current photograph. No recent activity. No new witness encounter. Only history. Only records. Only DNA. The case could be solved only by connecting the past to the present. And DNA became that bridge. A biological signature from the crime scene was connected to a relative. The relative led investigators toward Troyer. Troyer's remains provided the reference. And the comparison confirmed the connection. The bridge was complete. 41 years had been crossed. On one side was Karen's death. On the other was the identification of her killer. Between them were generations of forensic development. That is why the story is more than a murder mystery. It is a story about evidence surviving time. It is a story about investigators refusing to accept that an unanswered question must remain unanswered forever. It is a story about how the smallest trace can become powerful enough to overturn decades of uncertainty. And it is a story about the limits of human memory. Witnesses may remember faces incorrectly. People may forget details. Stories may change. But DNA does not construct a narrative. Simply exists. That makes it different. The evidence does not care about the reputation of the person it identifies. It does not care whether the suspect is famous. It does not care whether the suspect is dead. It does not care whether 40 years have passed. It simply provides a biological connection. And in Karen's case, that connection was enough. The mystery that began on a quiet California morning finally had an ending. But the ending was not dramatic. There was no courtroom. No confession. No final confrontation. There was only a laboratory result and a name. That may sound anticlimactic. It is not. Because for a family waiting 41 years, a name can be enormous. A name can end nightmares. A name can end speculation. A name can close a chapter that has remained open for generations. A name can finally tell the children of a murdered woman that the man responsible has been identified. And that is what happened. The investigation had started with uncertainty. It ended with identification. The killer was not hiding anymore. He had been gone for decades. But the evidence had finally caught up with him. Karen's life could not be restored. Her family could not reclaim the lost years. The unanswered questions about motive and final moments might remain unanswered forever. But the central mystery was gone. The man behind the biological evidence had been identified. And that fact would remain long after every detective involved in the case was gone. Long after the headlines faded. Long after the databases changed again. Long after the neighborhood changed again. The evidence had spoken. And this time the world listened. The most unsettling thing about a solved cold case is that the word solved can sound much more complete than the reality. For Karen Kloss, the investigation had finally reached a conclusion. But the life that had been taken from her remained beyond recovery. The evidence could identify a man. It could not return a mother to her children. It could not recreate the morning that had been stolen. It could not erase the image of a family suddenly forced to understand that Karen was never coming home. And it could not answer every question that had accumulated during 41 years of silence. That is where the story becomes darker. Because once investigators identified Kenneth Eugene Troyer, people could finally look backward at the case with a different understanding. The unknown attacker was no longer an abstract figure. He had a history. He had a criminal record. He had been in prison. He had escaped. He had later encountered police in circumstances that ended with his death. And yet, despite all of that, his connection to Karen's murder remained hidden until forensic science uncovered it decades later. That fact raises a disturbing possibility. How many times had the world passed near the answer without recognizing it? How many investigators had looked at the case without knowing the name they needed? How many years had the evidence existed in a form nobody could fully interpret? The answer is impossible to calculate. But the timeline tells us something. Troyer was alive when Karen was killed. He died in 1982. The murder remained officially unresolved for another 35 years. That means the investigation continued long after the person responsible had vanished from the living world. For detectives, that creates an extraordinary challenge. A living suspect leaves a trail. A dead suspect leaves history. Investigators cannot follow him. They cannot watch where he goes. They cannot search his current home. They cannot interview his friends about what he did yesterday. They have to reconstruct his life from records that may have been created for entirely different reasons. And then there is the question of evidence. What remained from the original crime? What had been preserved? What could still be tested? What could be trusted? What could be compared? The answer eventually came from biological evidence. But the breakthrough was not simply a matter of putting an old sample into a machine. Cold case DNA work requires context. Investigators need to know what the evidence is, where it came from, how it was collected, whether it was contaminated, whether it can be reliably associated with the crime. And then they need a comparison. That is where familial searching became so important. A direct database match had not immediately identified the unknown offender. But a relative could provide the path. The relative did not solve the murder. The relative opened the door. Behind that door was the Troyer family. And behind the family connection was Kenneth Eugene Troyer. Investigators then had to do what investigators always do. They had to verify. The name alone was not enough. The history had to fit. The chronology had to fit. The biological evidence had to fit. And the final comparison had to be strong enough to establish the connection. When the DNA evidence linked Troyer to the biological material recovered during the investigation, the decades of uncertainty finally collapsed. The unknown offender had been identified. But Karen's family still had to absorb what that meant. For decades, the killer had existed as a possibility. A shadow. A question. Now the shadow had become a man. That transformation can be psychologically enormous. There is a difference between fearing an unknown killer and knowing his identity. The unknown can be imagined as anyone. The known can be studied. The known can be placed into history. The known can be understood as a person who lived, committed crimes, was eventually killed, and left behind biological evidence that investigators would one day use against him. The mystery becomes less supernatural. And somehow that can make it more disturbing. Because the killer was not a phantom. He was a human being. Someone who lived in the same world as Karen. Someone whose actions intersected with hers for a brief and catastrophic period. Then he disappeared. The years did the rest. There is another detail that makes the case difficult to emotionally resolve. Troyer never stood before Karen's family. He never heard the impact of his actions described to him. He never answered questions from detectives about that morning. He never explained himself. He never offered a motive. He never apologized. He was already dead. That means the family received the truth without receiving an explanation. And those are not the same thing. Knowing who did something does not always tell you why. The motive remains one of the most painful gaps in the Karen Kloss case. Investigators could identify the offender through evidence. But they could not enter his mind. They could not reconstruct every decision. They could not know what he intended before he entered the home. They could not know exactly what he was thinking during the attack. And they could not ask him after the fact. So the case has a boundary. On one side is what the evidence establishes. On the other is what can only be imagined. Responsible investigators have to respect that boundary. The facts are powerful enough. Karen was attacked. She suffered catastrophic injuries. She died days later. Biological evidence from the investigation produced a DNA profile. That profile was eventually connected through familial searching to Kenneth Eugene Troyer. A reference sample associated with Troyer confirmed the connection. Those are the facts. Beyond them lies uncertainty. And uncertainty is often where sensational stories become dangerous. It is easy to invent a motive. Easy to create a conversation that never happened. Easy to describe thoughts that no one could possibly know. But the real story does not need invented details. The reality is already disturbing. A mother was murdered. Her children lost her. A killer remained unidentified for decades. The killer died. The evidence survived. And 41 years later, science connected that evidence to his name. That is enough. More than enough. The case also demonstrates how much a single investigation can depend on preservation. Imagine if the biological evidence had been discarded. Imagine if it had been contaminated beyond use. Imagine if the records had disappeared. Imagine if investigators decades later had nothing left to test. The identity of Karen's killer might have remained permanently unknown. The breakthrough was possible because something from 1976 survived into the future. That is the hidden hero of many cold cases. Not a detective. Not a witness. Evidence. Evidence has no memory. But it can preserve history. A witness may forget what happened. A document can preserve the statement. A suspect may die. DNA can preserve the biological connection. A detective may retire. The case file can remain. The preservation of those fragments creates a bridge between generations. The investigators who eventually identified Troyer inherited work begun by people they may never have met. They did not have to start from zero. They had a crime scene. They had reports. They had evidence. They had the history of previous investigative efforts. And they had technology capable of asking new questions of old material. That is why the breakthrough should not be understood as one sudden miracle. It was the result of time, persistence, and scientific progress converging. The first investigators could not solve the case. Later investigators could. Not because the original investigators had failed to care. Because the tools had changed. The same evidence that could not identify a killer in 1976 eventually became capable of identifying him in the 21st century. That is a powerful lesson. A cold case can appear dead when it is actually dormant. The difference is enormous. Dead means there is nothing left. Dormant means something remains. Karen's case had something left. A biological trace. A genetic profile. A connection waiting to be discovered. And eventually that connection appeared. The announcement of the identification therefore carried significance far beyond one homicide. It showed what modern forensic investigation could accomplish when old evidence was preserved. It showed that time does not always protect a killer. And it showed families of other victims that an unanswered case is not necessarily an impossible case. But for Karen's sons, this was never simply about forensic technology. Their mother was gone. That was the reality they had lived with since childhood. The investigation could finally explain who was responsible. Could not change their childhood. It could not give them back the moments they had missed. It could not make Karen appear at the door. The distinction between information and restoration is critical. Investigators can restore information. They cannot restore lives. They can restore a name to a mystery. They cannot restore a person to a family. And that is why the emotional conclusion of Karen's case remains complicated. There was relief. There was closure. There was also grief. Because solving the murder meant confronting the fact that the killer had been identified, but Karen was still gone. The answer did not replace the loss. It simply removed one layer of uncertainty. For decades, the family had lived with an open question. Now the question had an answer. And perhaps that was the most valuable thing investigators could give them. A name. A verified connection. A final piece of truth. There would be no trial. No sentence. No prison. But there was something that could no longer be taken away. The historical record. Kenneth Eugene Troyer had been identified as the man whose DNA connected him to Karen's murder. His death could not erase that conclusion. His absence could not make the evidence disappear. The decades could not return the case to the status of an unknown homicide. The truth had moved forward. And once truth moves forward, it is difficult to force it backward. That is the enduring power of forensic evidence. It does not need the killer to be alive. It does not need a confession. It does not need a courtroom to exist. It needs evidence. And Karen's case had evidence. For 41 years it waited. Then the technology caught up. The unknown became known. And the silence surrounding one California murder was finally broken.